So next, let's talk about the fact that ibuprofen and other non-steroidals do slightly increase the risk of an individual having a heart attack and having a stroke. So to understand why, we need to just understand a little bit about what happens in a heart attack and a stroke. So a little bit of background, and I've written down some key words here. So let's start off with a heart attack. So a heart attack happens in individuals with ischemic heart disease, or IHD. This is a disease of the coronary arteries. So the heart is a muscle, it needs oxygen, it needs nutrients in order to work. So it actually has its own little blood vessels which supply it with nutrients, and these are called the coronary arteries. Now, unfortunately, as we get older, a disease can affect the wall of arteries that is called atherosclerosis. And this is a disease where those walls become thicker and they impinge in on the lumen of the blood vessel and make the lumen narrower. And when they affect an artery, it means that less blood is going to flow through that vessel, and therefore less blood is going to be supplied to the end tissue. This is what has happened in individuals with ischemic heart disease. They have atherosclerosis affecting the coronary arteries that supply the heart. Now, risk factors for atherosclerosis, one of the major ones is age. So it's something generally that, a 20-year-old isn't going to have bad atherosclerosis affecting any of the arteries in their body, but older people, 60s and 70-year-olds, they're more likely to have atherosclerosis in their blood vessels. But other risk factors are things like smoking, being obese, being diabetic, and having high cholesterol. All of those accelerate atherosclerotic process and mean that you're more likely to get significant atherosclerosis in your lifetime that is going to result in problems. And that indeed is what people with ischemic heart disease have. They have significant atherosclerosis in their coronary arteries. Now, one thing that this results in is a chronically reduced blood supply to the heart, and that results in things like angina. It means their heart isn't going to be as good as it was previously, and if they try to do exercise, it's not going to cope with it, and they're going to get pain. And that is what angina is. It's cardiac pain that occurs when someone tries to exert themselves, and it's happening because that individual has ischemic heart disease often. However, the other massive risk with ischemic heart disease is that these diseased atherosclerotic blood vessels are capable of triggering thrombosis to occur within blood vessels, and I'm going to write this down because this is a key word that I've forgotten. So thrombosis is a key word here. So what does this mean? So the blood has things in it that are capable of forming a blood clot, and this is supposed to happen if a hole is produced within a blood vessel. So if a blood vessel gets cut, let's say I cut a blood vessel, what is supposed to happen is the blood is then supposed to be activated to form a blood clot that will clot up that hole and stop blood from leaking out of it. That is normal blood clotting. However, if that process that leads to the blood clotting is activated inside a normal intact blood vessel, then that is called thrombosis. And that's not good. You do not want blood clots to form inside blood vessels. They are going to cause massive problems. Now, unfortunately, atherosclerotic blood vessels have a nasty habit of triggering off this thrombotic process. And if that happens inside of one of these atherosclerotic coronary arteries, then that blood clot that is forming in that atherosclerotic coronary artery can end up completely occluding the artery up so that no blood will flow through it. So the lumen of the blood vessel is now going to be completely clogged up with this blood clot and no blood will flow through. And that's going to completely cut off blood supply to a huge portion of the heart. And that portion of the heart will then die, and that's what happens in a heart attack. And indeed, heart attacks can kill people instantaneously because they can result in complete electrical chaos occurring in the heart, which then leads to the heart no longer beating and a cardiac arrest, which is fatal. If the heart attack doesn't lead to that electrical chaos, doesn't lead to a fatal arrhythmia, then the individual will survive, but of course their heart's permanently going to be disabled now because a huge portion of it has died and won't be replaced with normal muscle tissue. It will be replaced with scar tissue. So their heart's going to be permanently weak, and that leads to its own bunch of problems in the long run as well. So that's what happens in a heart attack. In a stroke, a very similar thing happens. In this case, the individual has atherosclerotic disease affecting the arteries within the brain, and we call this cerebrovascular disease, or CVD for short, although this is a bad abbreviation because CVD can just stand for cardiovascular disease, which means atherosclerosis anywhere in the cardiovascular system, but I'm using it here to mean cerebrovascular disease, so vascular disease in the brain. So these atherosclerotic blood vessels in the brain, they can also trigger off thrombosis to occur inside them, and that can then block off one of these cerebral blood vessels, cutting blood supply to a certain portion of the brain, and again, that portion of the brain will die. That is what is happening in a stroke. It's where a portion of the brain dies because of a blood clot that has formed inside one of the blood vessels that supplies that portion of brain. And when that bit of brain dies, it will then need to, whatever that portion of the brain does, you'll lose that function. So if that portion of the brain is important in moving part of your body, it's going to mean that you're no longer able to move that part of the body. And again, when that portion of the brain heals, it's actually quite interesting that the heart and the brain, the two most vital organs, they're really bad at healing. They're the worst organs in the body for healing. When you look at like the liver's fantastic at healing if part of it is injured. Whereas the heart and the brain are really bad at healing. They're not good at healing. When they do try to heal from an event like this, an ischemic event, they heal by scarring rather than by regeneration. So again, that portion of the brain isn't going to heal potentially very well. So you might have permanent neurological disability after suffering a stroke. So overall, the point that I've got across here is that both in a heart attack and a stroke, there is thrombosis occurring in diseased atherosclerotic blood vessels that cuts off blood supply. Now, this is why non-steroidals are not a good idea in people at risk of having these. So in people with ischemic heart disease or cerebrovascular disease, people who are known to have these, you do not want to be prescribing non-steroidals. The reason is that certain prostaglandins, again, remember there are a huge number of different prostaglandins, some involved in inflammation, others involved in normal physiology. So certain prostaglandins are actually involved in controlling whether the blood clots or not, and they are actually anti-thrombotic, so they are continuously involved in stopping the blood from clotting. So there's prostaglandins at work all over your body at the moment, inside your blood vessels, that are stopping, continuously telling blood not to clot, sending signals to the components of the blood that are involved in the clotting process and telling them not to clot. And when you lose those prostaglandins that do that, because you've taken ibuprofen or another non-steroidal, you are at then slight increased risk of thrombosis occurring. So if you have these diseases that are potentially going to cause thrombosis, you do not want to be taking a drug that also adds on a little bit increased risk that this thrombosis is now going to occur. So that is another group of people you do not want to prescribe ibuprofen or indeed any other non-steroidal to, anyone with ischemic heart disease or cerebrovascular disease. So again, this is a reason why you generally don't want to prescribe it to people over the age of 60, because again, those are the people at risk of having these diseases, whether diagnosed or potentially undiagnosed as of yet.